Good afternoon and welcome to the Coral Gables Museum. My name is Carolyn Farmer. I'm the Director of Programs here at the museum. So on behalf of the museum, I welcome you all here. We have a wonderful event today, and we have an excellent exhibition on the Beyond Swastika and Jim Crow exhibit, which have you all been back there to see it? Yes or not yet? Just so you know, not to worry. There will be time after this panel to go back and see the exhibition. It's really not to be missed. And this panel is obviously a related event in complement to that exhibition, so you really can see it. The exhibit came to us, was originally produced by the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. Traveled to the country. We're very proud to say that this is the last stop that we were able to host it before it came to a close. Been traveling the country and it's been very well received. We're so happy to have it. Just this morning I led a youth group from Temple Judea, middle schoolers through the exhibit. Tomorrow we have another group coming through, and it's just gotten a lot of activity and it's been received very well by all. So thanks for coming. We're very proud of this exhibition. And the truth is that we wouldn't have this exhibition here if it wasn't for FIU. So Michael Gillespie, who is our panel moderator today and the director of the Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment at FIU, came to us with several of his colleagues from the literature department, from the exile studies department, and said, there's this exhibition going around years ago, and what an opportunity it would be for you all to host it. And we've been so pleased to say host, and because FIU really has the professors who are the experts in this field, we've also been very fortunate that FIU has helped us create all of the public programs that are presented in common to this exhibit. And Michael, who is in today's panel, can tell you a little more about some of these events that are coming up just in the next week or two. So a full conference events, we've set everything out on this table right here for you. So please pick those up, stick them on your refrigerator, whatever it is you like to do, put in your iPhone, mark your calendars, and please join us again. I also should mention that this month is Miami Attractions Month. So that means that if you want to visit us or any other cultural venue in Miami-Dade County, you can go to MiamiAttractionsMonth.com and print out a 2-for-1 voucher. There's 2-for-1 admission all month, so support your cultural venues. The Coral Gables Museum presents bike tours. We just had one this morning, walking tours, exhibit tours, all the time. Our focus here is civic arts, architecture, urban design, sustainable development, and those are the kinds of exhibits we present. We also have an exhibition here called Creating a Dream. This is the vision of George and Merritt, of course, our city's founder, so we can always learn more about our city and our heritage through this museum. So we welcome you back and encourage you to volunteer with us, join, become a member, and all of that. And again, after today's panel, there will be time to go back and see Beyond Swastika and Jim Crow, as well as Creating a Dream, which will be open probably until about 6 o'clock today. So without further ado, Dr. Michael Gillespie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carolyn. It's a great pleasure to be here on behalf of my colleague, Dr. James Sutton, Chair of the English Department, and Dr. Asher Milbauer, who is Head of Graduate Studies in English and also directs the Exile Studies program. The three of us worked with the Coral Gables Museum, which is very generously brought this exhibition in and then supported the events that we have come up with to complement this very fine exhibition. The idea from the start was that this is a teaching moment, and if you have already seen the exhibition, you'll understand what I'm talking about. If you see it later on, it will be obvious very quickly. The exhibition is much more in a narrative than most museum exhibitions. It tells a story, but it also provokes a lot of ideas, and we are hopeful that the event that we have today and the events that we will be having over the next few months provide a venue to explore those ideas and to exchange ideas. To that end, in addition to today's event, tomorrow at the Gable stage, we're very fortunate to have a staged reading of The Hampton Years, a play by Jacqueline Lawton, who has very graciously agreed to come down here both for the panel and for the staged reading that deals very intimately with the complex relationships between mentor and mentee in a historically black college. At that time, the Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. As I said, it is at the Gable stage. The production begins at 7 p.m. It is free and open to the public, and these flyers, along with the flyers of the other events that I'll be mentioning, are on the table near the door. On Tuesday, at the Jewish Museum of Florida, Dr. Guy Stern will present a documentary entitled The Ritchie Boys, which chronicles the endeavors, the work of a group of an American military unit made up primarily of German refugees who came to the United States, entered the American military, were trained at Camp Ritchie in Maryland, and then returned to Europe as part of the Allied invasion. And Dr. Stern is not only a scholarly expert in this area, but was himself a Ritchie boy. So it will be a very rich evening. I'm sorry, I didn't think of this. It will be a very full evening. Again, the entire information is on the table. Later in the week, on Thursday, Dr. Stern will give a formal lecture at FIU at 7 p.m. And a week from tomorrow, Dr. Donald Coonigan will be coming down from the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Coonigan was a student at Toluga College and was instructed by German Jewish refugee scholars, and will speak both of his personal experience and of the broader academic implications. I hope you'll be able to attend these events. If you are interested in information about others, please let me know at the end of the presentation, and I'll be sure you get on the Humanities Center mailing list. I will introduce the four panelists that we're very fortunate to have here today. Brief introductions. If I gave each the introduction he or she deserves, we wouldn't have much time for discussion. So these are the abridged versions in every case. After each gives about a 10-minute presentation, there'll be questions, and then, as Caroline said, after this presentation, there should be time for those of you who wish to see the exhibition to walk through it. The first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Temetro Hopkins, who is an associate professor of English at FIU. She is the series editor of World Englishes and editor of the Carrier Pigeon, and is a Miami native, and will speak from that experience. The second speaker, Dr. Guy Stern, is director of the Harry and Wanda Zuleman Institution of the Righteous I'm sorry, I should put my glasses on. I can't read my own writing, and I'll have to suppress my vanity for a moment. Institute of the Righteous at the Holocaust Memorial Center in Franklin Hills, Michigan. He's published widely in English and German, and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Grand Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. The third speaker, Dr. Alan Berger, is the Raddick Family Eminent Scholar Chair in Holocaust Studies at Florida Atlantic University. He's published numerous books and articles in Holocaust studies, including The Continuing Agony from Carmelite Convent to Crosses at Auschwitz, which was nominated for the American Catholic Historical Association's John Gilray Shea Prize. And finally, Ms. Jacqueline Lawton, our playwright, is both the author of The Hampton Years and 11 other plays. Her works have been performed at venues as diverse as the Folger Shakespeare Library and Theater J in Washington, D.C. She was named one of the top 30 national leading black playwrights by Area Stage American Voices of the New Playwrights Institute. Please join me in welcoming our four panelists. Professor Hopkins, would you begin, please?
Sure. I will begin my discussion by talking about the historically black colleges and universities to which the refugees served. Historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs as they are most often referred to, are the only educational institutions in the United States that were designed and created for the sole purpose of educating blacks, or at the time, newly freed enslaved Africans. The majority of these institutions were established after the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, Africans and their descendants were simply not educated, were not given any access to any kind of formal education. The few who could read or write became literate through the generosity of their slave master, who provided literacy skills on the plantation. And those African descendants who became somewhat literate would in turn teach other enslaved Africans how to read and write. But this literacy was minimal, to say the least. This was certainly the case with Frederick Douglass, who, having obtained his literacy in this manner, would teach other enslaved African descendants how to read and write. The ban on educating the enslaved African descendants applied largely to those who lived in the slaveholding states in the South. Many African descendants who lived in the North and who were not enslaved were given some exposure to education. The first and oldest HBCU institution, Cheyney University, was established prior to the Civil War in 1837 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Quaker philanthropist Richard Humphreys started the school to instruct African descendants in basic literacy skills in order to obtain a job. The school started as the Institute for Colored Youth. Its main instruction at the time offered only elementary and high school level instruction. It later developed into an institution of higher learning focusing on the mechanic, arts, trades, and agriculture, as well as the classics. The main goal of this institution and those that followed were simply to train African descendants to establish a trade in agriculture or as teachers. Most of the HBCUs were established in the slaveholding states following the Civil War. Their main goal was to provide education to the newly freed slaves. They were established under the auspices of the Federal Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, known as the Freedmen's Bureau, by black churches and also by black churches and white philanthropies. The Freedmen Bureau helped to establish several colleges to include, as we all know, Howard University, Atlanta University, now commonly known as Clark Atlanta University, St. Augustine College, which is in North Carolina, Fisk University, and Johnson C. Smith University in North Carolina. Churches such as the American Missionary Association, the Disciples of Christ, and the Methodist Episcopal Church founded HBCUs for religious education and training. Tougaloo College in Mississippi, Dillard in Louisiana, and Talladega in Alabama are schools that developed under this association. The first HBCUs were private, nonprofit institutions. That is, they were established and funded by non-government support. Two federal laws helped to establish and finance publicly funded HBCUs. The National Grant College Act of 1862 or what is referred to as the first Morrill Act, which provided land and federal dollars to the state for the establishment of colleges that would provide higher education to lower and middle-income African Americans. Alcorn State University was established with the Morrill Act funds. Most of the institutions established under the first Morrill Act funds enrolled only white students. It was only after Congress passed the second Morrill Act in 1880, which required that all states that maintain dual segregated higher education systems for white and African American students provide at least one land-grant college for African Americans, and that the funding needed to establish and maintain the black colleges would be equal to that of white colleges. Following the second Morrill Act, about 19 HBCUs were established, to include Southern University, North Carolina A&T, and the University of Arkansas in Pine Bluff. In the early part of the 20th century, most of these HBCUs were classified as normal schools because their training focused on education, training African Americans to be teachers in primary and secondary schools. These teachers were responsible for the bulk of education provided to African Americans. Despite the provisions of the second Morrill Act, most of these HBCUs lacked sufficient funding, and education was low and inequitable in comparison to white land-grant colleges. In order to stay afloat, both the public and the private HBCUs survived with the assistance of wealthy white philanthropists, black churches, and foundations. In the 1910s and 20s, HBCUs underwent major changes, expanding their educational offerings from teacher education to professional schools. Howard University and Meharry Medical College established professional schools for medicine, dentistry, and pharmacy. Howard also offered law degrees. In addition to the professional schools, Howard and Fisk began offerings in undergraduate and graduate programs. About half the students at Fisk University were enrolled in scientific fields. Other HBCUs also dropped their teacher education and training programs and began expanding their course offerings in liberal arts, science, classics, and other subjects. Most of these were in response to the large number of African American World War I veterans who sought higher education opportunities. Also during this time, African Americans began to take on leadership positions that were formerly held by whites in these institutions. It was only until 1926 that they began to move to providing leadership positions in these schools to African Americans. Mordecai Johnson became the first African American president of Howard University. And then these leadership roles by African Americans soon took over the other HBCU schools. A lot of these took over by protest. The Supreme Court's decision in the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 and 1955, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 brought major changes to HBCUs. It became unlawful for states to operate segregated public education systems. Prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, HBCU schools provided the only means of higher education for African Americans in the South. But now, with African American given access to white institutions, enrollment in HBCUs began to decline. Due to these declines and the continuing lack of adequate funding from states and other sources, some HBCUs closed or merged with other institutions, while others just simply limped along, continuing their struggle to survive. And there are major changes that occurred after that. There are 4 HBCU institutions in the state of Florida. We have Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach, Florida. We have Edward Waters College in Jacksonville, Florida. We have Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida, and Florida Memorial University, our very own right here in Miami Gardens. Of the 4 HBCUs in Florida, only Florida A&M is a public university. The others are private, sponsored by religious denominations. The Bethune part of Bethune-Cookman University was named after its founder and educator, Mary McLeod Bethune. She started the school in a rented house with 5 students, and in 2 years, enrollment had grown to 250 students. Within 10 years, the school had grown into the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute and was affiliated with the United Methodist Church. The school later absorbed the Cookman Institute for Boys in Jacksonville and was named the Bethune-Cookman College. In 1924, the school started as a high school with junior college courses, a 2-year college in 1939, and a 4-year college in 1947 with grade A accreditation. Today, Bethune-Cookman has a student body of over 3,000 students and offers bachelor's of science degrees in 39 major areas: business education, humanities, nursing, science, mathematics, and social sciences. Edward Waters College, the Reverend Charles H. Pierce, supported by his church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, established the school to educate newly emancipated blacks. As with all the other HBCUs in their early development, the school started out offering courses at the elementary, high school, college, and seminary levels. It went through several names before its final name, Edward Waters College, named after the 3rd bishop of AME Church. Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, commonly known as FAMU, was founded in Tallahassee in 1887. As with Bethune, FAMU started out with 15 students. In 1910, enrollment had increased to 317 students, and the college awarded its first degree. In 1953, with an increase in students and staff, the college's name was changed by legislative action from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical College to Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. In 1971, FAMU was recognized as a full partner in the 9-university public higher education system of Florida. And it's perhaps safe to say that the majority of public school systems in the African American communities here in South Florida were staffed by FAMU graduates. Florida Memorial University is the only HBCU school located in Miami, Florida. While the university was founded in 1879, it did not begin here in Miami until 1963. It was founded in 1879 as the Florida Baptist Institute in Live Oak, Florida. In 1882, it was established as the Florida Baptist Academy in Jacksonville, Florida. The name was later changed to Florida Normal and Industrial Institute and moved to St. Augustine in 1918. In 1941, the Lion Oak branch and the St. Augustine branch merged, and they moved from its limited offerings from a junior college to a 4-year liberal arts institution, which graduated its first class in 1945. In 1950, its name was again changed to Florida Normal and Industrial Memorial College. In 1963, the school underwent another name change to Florida Memorial College and relocated to Miami in 1968. It graduated its first class at Miami in 1972, and then the institution's name changed to Florida Memorial University in 2006. And in ending, I would just like to talk about the benefits of attending an HBCU school. If you were to ask the average student who graduated from an HBC school, what is it about an HBC school in terms of its offerings that you would never have found in a non-HBC school? And almost in all cases, the #1 answer was nurturing. HBC schools nurtured their students. It didn't matter whether or not students came fully prepared or not so prepared. The teachers had a stake in them, and they worked very hard to make sure that all of them succeeded in school. So that nurturing aspect was very vital in HBCU schools, and many students benefited from that. As part of that benefit, many students had confidence that I don't think that many students who attended non-HBCU schools had. And they felt that it was their responsibility to take on a leadership role, to return to the community all that they had received. And many of these students took on these leadership roles. In fact, that most of these students, up until I would say the civil rights movement, the leaders in Miami, I would venture to say that all of them graduated from HBCU schools. They provided, for example, a very strong historical background to these students. They knew their history. If you really want to learn history of African Americans, you can learn it by just talking to an HBCU students. In non-HBCU schools, you remember that back in the 60s, the 1960s, African Americans had to fight for some recognition of this history. They had sit-ins for African American Studies Department. I used to be part of one of those sit-ins in 1960 in order to get knowledge of their history. This was a given in HBCU schools. I remember talking to one of the HBCU students, and they were talking about Michael King, and I couldn't figure out who was Michael King. I didn't know that that was Martin Luther King's original name, and that it was changed to Martin Luther King by his father later on to agree with Martin Luther. I mean, that was the kind of knowledge that you got from being associated with a student who graduated from an HBCU school. And students who graduated from an HBCU schools would generally insist, or their children would almost automatically attend an HBCU schools, because it was very important that they get that kind of an education that I don't think that they would have gotten in a non-HBCU schools. Unfortunately, after the Civil Rights Bill, things changed, and there were students who moved away from HBCU schools to be part of the non-HBCU schools because they felt that they would get better recognition, such as going to Yale or to Harvard. But I don't think that they would have gotten as much as they would have gotten or by staying in or attending an HBCU school. Unfortunately, I was not able to be a student of an HBCU school, and I really feel that that was a great loss on my behalf. But I benefit by being associated with many students who have graduated from HBCU schools. So I'll end here.
Thank you very much. Dr. Stern?
Thank you. I'm thrilled to hear the experiences of Professor Hopkins, because it lends a personal touch to what an exhibit can show and cannot show, and that is the emotion it impels and the lessons it imparts, and that, of course, is the subtitle of this conference. And encouraged by her approach, I have also taken the liberty to take two personal experiences, not because they are furtherances of progress reports, but rather because they give you an idea, especially the younger ones amongst you, and everyone in the audience is younger than I, so it gives me it gives a chance to set the stage of what was accomplished beyond what the exhibit can show. I would like to say, as the introduction kindly mentioned, I was in the service between 1942 and 1945, and I was a member of the U.S. Army Intelligence Service. Now, when I got to camp for training at that particular specialty, after my basic training, I found out within a very short time that it was a lily-white campus, if you want to call an Army base a campus, and there was one black sergeant among all of us. And I didn't think much about it at the time. He was in charge of our recreation hall and gave out ping pong balls and rummy cards and stuff like that, which I don't think taxed him very much. except when we got into an argument and appealed to him, he would give a clever answer, and that is stuck in my memory. He said, well, you fellows are in the intelligence, but intelligence is not in you. So I remembered this black soldier, and after the war, it occurred to me that I had met a remarkable personality, because he was not an unknown person even at the time we were at Camp Ritchie, Maryland. His name was William Warfield, and William Warfield is arguably one of the greatest baritones of his generation. And all of you have heard him, at least his rendition of Old Man River. He was also in many productions of Porgy and Bess. So when he came to my current residence in Detroit, I asked whether I could have lunch with him in reminiscence of our common service, and he agreed. So we were sitting there, and I said, reminded him of some incidences which he didn't remember all that well, but he knew they were true. And then I said, how do you feel about it? And he said, you know, I came to Camp Ritchie with the same type of training that all of you had had. I spoke German fluently with my voice training. I steeped myself in German background because I sang German lieder. And when I got to Camp Ritchie, couldn't they have done something else with me than give out ping pong balls? And I think that characterizes that even the Army, where we wore the same uniform, where we all went to the same mess hall, properly so named, that we, why shouldn't he have been given a post? Certainly he couldn't have been a spy, he would have been somewhat conspicuous, but he could have been an interpreter of documents for which he was fully qualified, or he could have been a specialist on maps and all that. We wasted talent by consigning him to that recreation hall. There's a second incident which I remember vividly, and which also goes perhaps another inch towards explaining the background of what I will tell. And that is, when I got back to St. Louis, the town I grew up after immigrating from Europe, the swimming pools were still segregated. All of a sudden, an edict came, probably tempted by the national trend towards equality, partially reached, and that was, you cannot discriminate in admitting people to publicly supported swimming pools like Heman Park, where I went swimming. And I will not go into details, but I tell you that this simple, what do we call it, concession? This simple trend towards equality was bought with bloody fights that those black youngsters had to carry out, and which were only overcome with the assuaging voices, like one of my relatives, very active in that movement. And finally, but did it have to take blood to bring about youngsters swimming in a swimming pool? Those are the backgrounds. Now, I saw this exhibit. It was at our Holocaust Museum prior to coming here, and I saw the pictures, and I heartily recommend, if you have not seen the exhibit yet, it is an American story of some impact. The exhibit is called Legacies is in the title, and Legacies is to an American historical past. So when I saw the exhibit, you mentioned the fact that here Jewish refugees unable to get positions at some of the more standoffish universities in the East and elsewhere, that here the youngsters, here the professors were devoting their best methods, their best knowledge to bring about an education for students at black colleges. It profited them because the exhibit also shows the outstanding educators, scientists, and performers that emanated from that experience, because they had some of them superstars as their professors. But I had gone through the exhibit several times, and I said to myself, didn't you miss something? I think to this very cheering story, shouldn't there have been a corollary? A corollary in the sense, haven't these outstanding scholars, most of them devoted liberals, couldn't they have done something, even if on a minute scale, couldn't they have done something towards equality, towards accessibility to education everywhere in the United States? Couldn't they have? And so I started researching, and I was not totally cheered. Some of them were of goodwill, most of them were, but of little action. And then I came across a story that I think here in the South particularly, if you consider yourself in that category, that particularly I thought would bring a bit of cheer into that often dreary story of the fight towards equality. And that is the following. You all know the American history books tell you that the first integration happened at the University of Georgia about in 1953, when against the wishes of the then somewhat muddle-headed governor of Georgia, pardon the expression, stood at the door of Georgia University and said, had he been able to speak Spanish, non pasaron. And then Attorney General Katzenbach, at orders of our president, brought them in the back way, and the University of Georgia was suddenly integrated. It's a good story, but it was not the first integration that happened. So that's what I found. You see, as you mentioned, I've written on exiles coming to the United States, and I thought, where was the college that drew a whole cluster of these refugee scholars into its walls? There were two high points. One in the East, in New York, the School of Social Studies, and the second one was at a small liberal arts, and particularly of arts, music, painting, composition, performance in Asheville, North Carolina, called Black Mountain College. It's a well-known college for that reason, because it left great liberty to developing artists and performers. And here many of the professors from Germany and Austria clustered because this white university or college was willing to hire them. So some of the really top people, like Albers from the Bauhaus, several composers from Germany, were clustered on the faculty of this small, very intensive college in North Carolina. And so generated at first by the students of that, they said, why should this be this freedom-loving, individually geared college? Why should it be segregated? And they made their wishes known to the administration. The administration didn't push it, and then they asked some faculty members to take hold, and now I have to tell a divided story. The students' initiative helped a great deal. The faculty, whether Native American or immigrants, was divided. Not because they didn't agree with the student initiative, but because they were afraid. Now, I don't need to tell you that fear in such a situation was unjustified. You all have read church burnings in the South and other outrages perpetrated, but they were afraid that the citizens of Asheville would storm the college and do damage to persons and property. I say it was not unjustified, but sometimes, and that is a legacy that I see from this exhibit as well, the legacy is that sometimes fear begets fear, and only the bold will succeed. The German refugees, some were among the intimidated, some were among the courageous. So they had a faculty meeting and said that, how do we feel? And finally, one professor stood up and he said, we have to do it. We have to take the student initiative, and smartly he argued it in the light of his own profession as a musicologist. He said, we are, in our minutes, we have said that we are here to preserve the musical tradition of the United States. How can we say we are preserving it if we have nobody trained and no trainees to preserve the spirit of the spirituals, the Negro spirituals? And that argument, that one man standing up and pushing it with the students together, started the ball rolling. The students, it was a laborious road, as you might imagine. The students first looked at applications, and indeed there was an application for a student who had just graduated from Spelman College, a black college, by the name of Elmer Stone Williams. And Elmer Stone Williams was a valedictorian of Spelman College, a bright young musicologist and performer on instruments. And so they wrote a letter to the president of Spelman College and got a ringing endorsement of her. And I might add that the president of Spelman College at that time was the first black president of a black college. Black colleges did not have black presidents until the father of Julian Bond, whose name is Howard Bond, and a famous educator in his own right, until he gave her that endorsement. And also she got various other people to stand behind her. So the students investigated her qualifications, because if you take a step like that, you of course want to lead with a very convincing case. She got in 1944, that is nearly 10 years before Southern colleges admitted blacks, the first integration of a white, all-white college happened at Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina, and there was no uproar from the town. And in an interview, in a later interview, as a graduate, Williams, who took that course in the summer of 1944, integrated, and she gave a proud interview of that, integrated the first white college with the aid of Professor Edward Lovinsky, who in later years became one of the leading musicologists on Renaissance and Baroque music. What is the legacy of this story? It is, again, that one person arguing, well, we can thank them, all of those who made the first integration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stern. Dr. Berger?
Well, I want to thank Professor Gillespie for his introduction, and he and Jamie Sutton and Asher Milbauer for inviting me. It's quite an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished participants. I'd like to start out by saying something about anti-Semitism in the Academy. And that is, it's a multi-layered phenomenon that contains both domestic and overseas elements, religious and secular components, political, psychological, and economic factors. But, not to worry, the museum closes at some point, and so do my remarks. This afternoon, I'm going to focus on three elements. A brief historical overview of this phenomenon, anti-Semitism in the Academy, the story of two Harvard presidents and national paranoia, and a reflection on the contemporary campus situation. But to begin with a brief historical overview, I think probably we need to define what is anti-Semitism. David Gerber, in a very important book titled Anti-Semitism in American History, distinguishes several ingredients or elements of this phenomenon. First, the belief that Jews are different and alien. The stereotypical view of Jewish people that views them negatively, power-hungry, materialistic. These negative traits are a product of malevolence toward others, especially non-Jews. The willingness to shun Jews, speak ill of them, or deny them social and legal rights that are afforded to non-Jews. In my view, these traits are succinctly summarized in Irving Howe's aphorism, "Inside the warmest of hearts, there's a cold spot for the Jews." We have the infamous example of Professor Lienhardt in Germany talking about Einstein saying, "We don't want any of that Jew physics." We also have the example of Heinrich von Treitschke, "The Jews are our misfortune." University professors. Wisdom does not reside necessarily in professors. There was, of course, a de facto numerus clausus applied to Jews on the part of the so-called elite, as well as many other educational institutions. And although I typically detest statistics because I don't understand them, I think that it's very instructive to compare the percentage of Jewish students at Harvard and at CCNY for 4-year periods, 1908 to 1909, 1915 to 1916, 1918 to 1919, and 1934 to 1935. Here we go. In 1908 to 1909, Harvard had a whopping total of 4.35% Jews as undergraduates. CCNY had 74.4%. From 1915 to 1916, Harvard had increased to 7.68%. CCNY had also increased to 84.99%. From 1918 to 1919, Harvard 10.1%, CCNY 78.73%. 1934 to 1935, 4 years before the outbreak of the First World War, Harvard had 17.01% of undergraduates who were Jewish. CCNY had 80.05. This discrepancy prompted some analysts to claim that CCNY, in fact, stood for Circumcised Citizens of New York. In part, this disparity was financial. It was far less expensive to attend a public school rather than an Ivy League institution. That still is the case, obviously. But there was a more ominous reason, which was articulated in a 1992 statement by the then Harvard president, A. Lawrence Lowell, who himself was an early supporter of the Immigration Restriction League and its vice president for the 10 years preceding that. President Lowell was disturbed by the influx of Jewish students. The Jewish students might take the place reserved for the sons of wealthy donors who might not give money. And besides, Jews were outsiders, others in a predominantly WASP culture. One Jewish student leader at Harvard reported that there was a feeling that, quote, good or bad, there were too many Jews on campus, and consequently, Harvard might turn into a new Jerusalem, a second city college of New York. President Lowell's logic, I think, is worth pondering. Reflecting the widespread belief that Jews were unassimilable, he reasoned that an increase in Jewish students on campus would lead inexorably to a growth in anti-Semitic feeling. This, of course, is to blame the victim for the crime. And I'm sure you've all heard the story of these two university professors. I was not one, unfortunately, who were taking a break during an academic conference. They had to get outside because in these conferences you typically just see the inside of a hotel room. And so they were walking, and one professor was about to step down on the sidewalk when a voice said, "Please, don't step on me." And he looked down and there was a frog. And so he bent down and picked up the frog, and the frog said, "Before a wicked witch cast a spell on me, I used to be a university president. And before you to turn me back into the university president, please repeat this formula and pass your hand over my head twice." So the professor put the frog in his pocket. His colleague said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Because a talking frog is worth a hell of a lot more than a university president." There are some exceptions, of course. There are some exceptions. Moreover, less than 2 decades later, at the 1938 Evian Conference, called to show Mr. Hitler that the civilized nations, I put civilized in quotation marks, would each take a certain number of Jews, thereby saving them from what was in store following the anti-Semitic outrages of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The Australian delegate attested that there was no anti-Semitism in his country because there were no Jews. Consequently, Australia would take in no Jews, and didn't. And the grand total of Jews taken in by the delegates at the representing the different countries at the Evian Conference, was none. Hitler got the message pretty clear. Justice Louis Marshall fought President Lowell's position, stating, I quote, "If Harvard established numerus clausus de jure, it might be responsible for pogroms and for stimulating anti-Semitism in the United States and abroad." Ironically, Marshall was opposed to the establishment of a Jewish university because he thought it would become a glorified ghetto, in his words, and would be an excuse for continuing discrimination at other universities. The plot thickens. I want to say just a couple of words about anti-Semitism and national paranoia. America in the eve of World War I was an isolationist nation with a strong nativistic strain. Anti-Semitic attitudes were common and voiced from both religious, Father Charles Coughlin, the infamous Father Charles Coughlin, and secular quarters, Henry Ford, who was alleged to have said history's just one damn thing after another. 6 months after the end of World War II, 55% of Americans agreed with the statement, quote, "Do you agree that Jews have too much power in the U.S.?" In December 1947, a New Republic survey of anti-Semitism in higher education reported that Amherst, Bryn Mawr, Dartmouth, Haverford, Middlebury, Mount Holyoke, Northeastern, Princeton, Swarthmore, Williams, and Yale were among the colleges enrolling, in the words of the report, conspicuously small numbers of Jews. Teaching English literature as an academic discipline was especially closed off to Jews because, quote, "they could not register the finer shadings of the Anglo-Saxon spirit as it's shown through the poetry of Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton." Yet, as Irving Howe notes, Christians did not seem similarly incapacitated with regard to the Old Testament. Scholars such as Ludwig Lewison and Lionel Trilling suffered exclusion and rebuff. T.S. Eliot, one of the two troubadours of modern anti-Semitism, the other was the paranoid anti-Semite Ezra Pound, Eliot's wasteland poetry was tinged with anti-Semitism, advocating for a Christian America with no appreciable room for Jews. All this transpired prior to Saul Bellows having the nerve to win the 1976 Nobel Prize for Literature. Parenthetically, I would like to add, in addition to this excellent Jim Crow and the Swastika exhibit on display here at the Coral Gables Museum, which shows the important role played by Jewish refugee scholars at historically black universities, as Professor Stern has recounted, and the reciprocal relationship between students and professor, is worth noting, at least in passing, the role played by the New School for Social Research in New York City, which provided a place for Jewish refugee scholars from Europe, including the controversial but brilliant Hannah Arendt. Although it has no national significance, or indeed much significance at all outside of my own faulty memory, my own experience at two universities reveals the unhappy staying power of the Jew as somehow dangerous and eternally other. Many years ago, in a job interview, I was asked whether I would use the position for which I was being interviewed to proselytize Christian students. The questioner was a reputable Christian scholar of religion. Nearly 2 decades later, a noted Muslim scholar asked me the same question. My own view is that both of these gentlemen were displaying what psychologists term projection. They weren't worried about what I was going to do, they were thinking what they would do. A reflection on the contemporary situation. Much has changed since the earlier situation of anti-Semitism in the academy. Jews have in fact become presidents of Ivy League colleges, much, I am sure, to the posthumous chagrin of President Lowell. Moreover, one unintended consequence of Jewish students being accepted to the Ivies is that Brandeis University, created at least in part to provide a quality education to qualified Jewish students, is now no longer necessarily the first choice school of these students. Nothing succeeds like success. Earlier, I promised the story of two Harvard presidents. The second one is Lawrence H. Summers, who in September 2002, responding to calls for Harvard University to divest from Israel, stated that such calls are anti-Semitic in their effect, if not their intent. He then correctly identified a major and troubling and continuing development in the ongoing history of anti-Semitism. In the past, anti-Semitism and profoundly anti-Israeli views have been espoused by poorly educated right-wing populists. It is now the case that profoundly anti-Israeli views are increasingly finding support in progressive intellectual communities. The entire saga of the so-called BDS, boycott, divest, sanction, Israel movement is a case in point. Finally, both right and left-wing politics have joined a common cause, in anti-Israel and among the extremes of both groups, anti-Semitic statements, attitudes, and actions. I might say the same prejudices exist against the African American community among these two groups. Middle Eastern politics is a constant source of oil poured on the flames of hatred. What is even more troubling than the response, or non-response, of many undergraduates who feel confused and uninformed about the Israeli-Palestinian debate is the existence of certain organized student groups, such as the Harvard Islamic Society and various Islamic student organizations located in different branches of the University of California system, who inject intimidation, classic anti-Semitic canards, and violent actions in responding to the situation. It is clear that the situation between Israel and the Palestinians is very complicated. And I think it's vital to distinguish legitimate criticism of the policies of the State of Israel. After all, the prophets of ancient Israel had their own criticism, on the one hand, from anti-Semitism on the other. Now, of course, it's quite common to, some of my best friends are Jews. It's Zionism I can't stand. But this, I suggest, is a distinction without a difference. Here I think of the American Studies Association fiasco. Recently, as some of you may know, American Studies adopted the BDS position. After voting to support the BDS movement, a spokesman was asked, with all of the trouble in the world, all of the discrimination, the bigotry, the beheadings going on, why did you choose Israel? And to which the spokesman responded, yes, it's all terrible, but we had to start somewhere. Here I think of Nathan Sharansky's 3 Ds when distinguishing legitimate criticism from plain old-fashioned anti-Semitism: demonization, delegitimation, and double standard. When you have these 3 Ds in operation, it's not criticism of Israeli policies, it's criticism of Israel's right to exist. And that is a major no-no. Great strides have been made in the academy, but the disease of anti-Semitism itself has proved resistant to therapies. Some of you perhaps have read Albert Camus' The Plague, which was composed incidentally in a farm about 5 miles from Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where 5,000 Protestants saved 5,000 Jews during the Second World War. The plague has to do with a plague, as you might infer from the title. Rats are coming up from underground, giving the plague to the citizens of the town. Finally, the doctor who's been fighting the plague, after many, many losses, is successful. The plague disappears, and the people of the town are celebrating and very pleased and happy everything is over, except only the doctor, Dr. Yu, knew that the rats were still underground, just waiting for the opportunity to come up again. So be careful of the rats. New therapies will have to be discovered to combat anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berger. And now Ms. Law.
Yeah, so it's perfect that I am going last because you've all set up the context for the play.
And so I'm a DC-based playwright, and one of my best friends works at Theater J. And the artistic director there, Ari Roth, has long been interested in the Black and Jewish relationship. So how can we stage this interesting story of our history? And I went to a reading series that they did, and I saw a reading about the Green Book. Do you all know about the Green Book? So it's this book that African Americans could look at to know different hotels, restaurants, gas stations they could go to and not be taken advantage of. The guy who wrote the play wrote the children's story, so it wasn't necessarily a play, but so I found out, oh, well, you want a play, I will write a play. That's what I do, actually, very egotistic to go home and say, I'm going to do this. But I did some research, I literally typed in Black and Jewish relations, and I found out about this exhibit, Beyond Swastika and Jim Crow. And I found this quote by John Biggers, and the quote is, "A new dawn challenges this world and demands the salt of every one of us. There can be no doubt of our sodality, for in each of us we reflect one another's image, and our composite image mirrors the tragedy and the comedy of the whole human race." And I was just struck by the power of that and the drama that was inherent into this. And I said, here's the play. And I learned more about Victor Lowenfeld, who's the Austrian Jewish professor who came and established Hampton Institute. I learned about Samela Lewis, and I'd never known about these artists. And I'm someone who's constantly doing research, constantly looking at people, and I couldn't believe that I didn't know about these amazing people. And I thought, if I don't know, surely there are a lot of people who don't know. And it was true. People did not know about Elizabeth Catlett. They didn't know about Charles White. And I was like, okay, I've got to write this story. I've got to tell this. So I wrote a little description, sent it over to Theater J, and they had done a locally run festival, so 6 playwrights writing about local history, and I just took on this story. And so the Hampton years, the original version that you all saw went from 1939 to 1946. So Victor actually chose Hampton over Harvard. He'd been courted by Harvard, and he said, no, I don't want to go there because if I go there, I'll be a part of a clog in the wheel kind of thing. Hampton had nothing at the time. They just had a few art classes, and he established the art department there. And so he and his wife and his young son, they fled the Holocaust, came to New York, and then came to Hampton. And I just became really interested in this idea of, because at the time when you look at what was happening at HBCUs, it was a vocation school. It was, you're going to learn how to be a plumber, you're going to be a teacher, you're going to be a nurse. To be an artist, like, are you kidding me? No, you're not going to do that. No one's going to let you be an artist. So you have this president in the play who's very much looking out for these young people as they go out into the world, what kind of professions they can have to have a livelihood. And you have this passionate professor who's like, no. Creative expression is the most important thing. We need Black artists to tell their stories so that we can understand more fully what's going on in the world. And so you have this constant battle between the president and Victor as he's trying to get more supplies and increase the budget to get more classes and that kind of thing. And at the same time, what you had is Elizabeth Catlett coming to teach, and her husband at the time, Charles White, he also came to teach. He was a part of the Rosenwald Scholarship, the fellowship for that Rosenwald established. He was the founder of Sears Roebuck, and he established with a lot of his legacy and money, Black schools, Black high schools across the South, and then also gave funding to scholars and playwrights and painters and artists of that ilk who were African American. And they came and they worked with these young people. And so what you see in the play is you see art world being explored. Who gets to be an artist, right? So, and who gets selected to be in the museum? And what happens when you're not a part of that because race is a barrier? And as an artist, what are you creating, okay? And so knowing that as an African American artist, everything I create is going to be a political conversation because the very nature of me creating work. So then what are you going to do about that? How are you going to make a statement? What is your legacy? What is your impact going to be? And then you also have the Navy, because Hampton Institute, now university, is right there at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, which is a huge port. You know, lots of battles that happen there. And so the Navy, Malcolm McLean, who's the president at the time, the first president at the time that Victor is there, he's a big Navy guy, and he's like, you know what, we've got to use this war to our advantage. We've got to train up our students, give them an opportunity that they can grow and have professions. And so they actually turned the school, they used a great deal of school for their training ground. This farm called Shuffle Farm is now actually where Langley is actually established. So these things are still residual. It's quite interesting. And the university changed. It went from a fall and spring to a fall, winter, spring. Everything changed to accommodate the war. And so you have the students John is arguing, you have these amazing smart professors, and they're doing kitchen duty and crew, so you have that argument come up in the play. It's like, why are we not using to the full advantage these brilliant, brilliant minds? So literally everything you guys have talked about is in the play. You have World War II, so the impact of World War II. This version of the play, it starts with Pearl Harbor. So you have these young people thinking, okay, now I've got to go to the Army. And you have this idea of the double B. You know the double B? So victory at home, victory abroad. This idea that African Americans would fight in the war abroad. They would fight for freedom and fight for justice, fight for democracy. And when they got home, things would have to be better for them. Because they've gone and they've proved themselves worthy of service, but then that wasn't happening. But it was this idea that double B would be of great use. So, and then the play ends in 1945 when Hitler is killed. And so you understand just the enormous impact of refugees living here in America. They're getting that news at the same time and what that means. And so for these Austrian folks who live in Vienna, Vienna is no longer there, no longer exists. So the idea of them going home, that's not a reality for them. This Virginia is now their new home and they have to establish themselves there. So again, looking at the Black and Jewish relation, you have this moment where the character Samela is, she's very feisty and she's wanting everything to happen for her now because she's like, I'm doing this now, I'm a great artist, how can I make this happen? She's really struggling with this idea of having African Americans fight in a war when so much horrible is going on in the U.S., so she's really struggling with that, so that you hear about that theme in the play. And then of course, academics. So you have this, at the time, Hampton Institute is going through this huge growth spurt of, we're vocational only, but you have all these people who are interested in liberal arts. Like, how do we allow these young people to be more than just the people working in the fields, the people working in the kitchen, the people doing that second-class job? So there's a lot of struggle. And so you have Dr. McLean, who was a great president. People really appreciated him. The next president after him was Ralph Bridgman, who was only there for a year because people couldn't stand him. He was a terrible president. And after him, they had the first Black president. So as I'm writing this play, and this was in 2012, 2013, it's all based on real people. So all of these events happened, and I got the chronology of all their lives and careers, and I laid it in the track of 1939 to 1947, and I'm blogging about it, so people are hearing about it. And so Victor Lowenfeld's son, John, finds out about the play. He and his entire family from California on come to see the production. So of course that's a lot of pressure, right? Because here's the son, and he's talked about in the play, and he was just touched, and it was really beautiful. I sent the play to Samela Lewis to read. She's still alive and still kicking, and she's, again, still a fiery, passionate person. And she loved the play. She actually said her words were, "Girl, this brought me back. I didn't expect it." And I teared up. I was like, this is amazing that for the people whose lives. Elizabeth Catlett passed in April of 2012, so I wasn't able to share it with her. But it's been a really amazing journey that this play has had. So it had the world premiere in DC. So you have people who were interested in history, war, art, all these people coming together. And my play was the first play by a Black playwright that's ever been performed at Theater J. So you even had that phenomenal kind of wow legacy moments that are happening. And then now it's in development. Because after the world premiere, there's the idea that, the play's finished, it'll go on. But it's like, no. We're going to keep working on the play, keep strengthening it, and now it's with 6 characters. And Virginia Stage Company, which is in Norfolk, which is right there in the neighborhood of where all of this is happening, they're producing it. So it's been a really exciting journey. And this is the second time that the play has been read as a part of the Beyond Swastika and Jim Crow exhibit, which is really cool, because the first time it was in Philadelphia, when it was at the National Museum of American Jewish History. So it's really great that the play can be a part of the actual exhibit that inspired the play to begin with. So I really appreciate the opportunity of having it read in affiliation with this exhibit.
Well, thank you very much for coming here. And thank you for I know that the museum will be closing shortly, but we do have a few minutes for questions and responses if you would care to raise any.
We were perfect.
Yeah.
We told you everything you needed to know.
Yes. Well, you're probably anxious to see the exhibit as well before it closes. So, seeing no questions, would you join me once again in thanking these 4 very fine speakers for their time? Thank you very much, all of you.
That was terrific.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr.
So it's
Stern. That
tomorrow
was
at 7.
very
at the
moving,
Legal
very
Station.
powerful.
Can you come? No, I know a lot